China remains firm in its opposition against THAAD deployment in the Republic of Korea. We will resolutely take necessary measures to safeguard our security interests.
China objects to South Korea and the United States deploying a controversial U.S. defense missile system on the Korean Peninsula. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. China reiterated its disappointment after a land swap deal. The agreement gave the Republic of Korea the land it needs to deploy the Terminal High Altitude Defense System known as THAAD. That system, developed by the United States, is designed to shoot down the short and medium-range ballistic missiles, such as those under development by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. South Korea maintains THAAD is a defensive system against threats from the DPRK and isn't meant to undermine the security of any country. China held bilateral talks with officials from the DPRK and Russia this week. In an exclusive interview with CGTN in Beijing, China Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zheng Shuang discussed China's position and its role in the region.
We have been playing a very positive and actually proactive role in maintaining the peace and stability in the Northeast Asia. And we have these bilateral meetings with both DPRK and with Russia, and just show our sincere effort to promote and preserve peace and stability in that region, especially on the Korean Peninsula. We would like to encourage all parties concerned to enhance their coordination and cooperation and work together to realize the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, for the maintenance of peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, and resolve relevant issues through consultation and negotiations.
Joining us now from Beijing is Tong Zhao. He's an associate in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Here with us in Washington, D.C. is Brian Becker. He's the national coordinator of the ANSWER Coalition. And my colleague, CGTN correspondent Nathan King, joins us as well. Thanks to all of you for being here. Nathan, let me start with you. We've been hearing of this THAAD system for quite some time right now. What is the exact status of its deployment?
Well, you remember it was actually agreed to by the Obama administration, and now we have a Trump administration on the American side. And so they're going ahead. In fact, Defense Secretary Mattis was in the region to actually sort of reassure the Republic of Korea that that would happen. We talked about the land purchase and swap. There are talks that it could be even deployed by this summer, in August. So it is moving very fast. Of course, we haven't mentioned domestic politics, of course, in the ROK, in South Korea, which, of course, are a bit of a mess right now with the impeachment. It depends, obviously, who comes in. There is some of the leading opposition, some of the leading candidates are actually lukewarm, and there is, of course, opposition growing by the day as well.
So given the domestic politics in South Korea, is there a question mark over deployment?
There's always a question mark over these deployments, but you know, it's a very high priority for the US, and amongst the military establishment in the ROK, it seems to be favored as well.
Nathan, obviously China's been following these developments very closely. It's lodged its objections to the deployment of THAAD. What are you hearing from Beijing?
Well, there's a two-track thing here. First, there's the Korean Peninsula, and you know, obviously China has a very different take on the Korean Peninsula than the US. Right. While they have united over UN sanctions, China has always said, you know, any introduction of new missile systems is inherently destabilizing, and have always wanted, you know, six-party talks resume. Carrots, yes, but sticks, yes, but also carrots. But there's a big domestic concern here. This is a very, very high-tech piece of kit, and even though it does intercept short, intermediate, and medium-range missiles, not a threat necessarily to China's ICBMs that could hit the US, the data it gathers and could relay surveillance data on Chinese and Russian missiles and other technology could actually be used to give the US advantage, especially in early warning systems, for example, when it comes to missile launches. And anything that's destabilizing when it comes to missiles or even a nuclear strategy could actually lead to a change in strategy. So it's destabilizing for the region as well.
Okay, let's go to Beijing, to Tong Zhuo. Tong Zhuo, China, of course, as I mentioned, is opposed to the deployment of the THAAD system. Let's first take a listen to what the Chinese Commerce Ministry spokesman Sun Jiwan had to say.
The United States and South Korea hastening to deploy the THAAD system in ROK has severely undermined China's strategic security interests, and popular will be foundation for the cooperation between China and ROK. We understand the legitimate concerns of relevant parties about their own safety. One country's security should not be established at the expense of other countries' security.
So, Tong Zhuo, we just heard Nathan tell us there about the capabilities of this THAAD system, but given what it can do, does it upset the strategic balance in that region?
Yes. Firstly, the deployment of THAAD missile defense doesn't really increase the security of South Korea or the United States. As most people already know, the American missile defense system hasn't been really tested against realistic battlefield scenarios. So there is no guarantee that this system would work reliably when there is indeed a North Korean missile attack. And secondly, the deployment of missile defense would only further fuel the existing arms race on the Korean Peninsula. Given that the North Korean objective is to possess a credible nuclear deterrent, there is no way that North Korea will sit on its hands and watching the South Koreans and the Americans deploy missile defense to undermine its nuclear deterrent. So the end result will be that North Korea will double down in its investment into deploying even more offensive missiles. So everyone's security interest will be undermined.
Brian, you've had experience of being in the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. They must be watching the deployment of THAAD as well. And do you think, as Tong Zhuo points out, that they will double down, they'll develop more systems?
Yes, I think the DPRK, when it withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty during the Bush years, when they had been identified as part of the axis of evil along with Iraq and Iran, and the United States proceeded to invade Iraq, they decided right then and there that they were going to acquire nuclear weapons. The best that the United States could hope for, perhaps, is to cap that nuclear weapons program in exchange, perhaps, for a peace treaty or the normalization of relations or the reduction of tension or the end of war games that are going on every year that threaten and simulate the destruction of North Korea. But, of course, North Korea will take countermeasures. This is an arms race. THAAD is not just a system. It means that we have gotten onto an escalation ladder. Each side will take countermeasures. And of course, from the point of view of both China and Russia, and both at the sub-ministry level this week, they issued a united statement saying, we will intensify our opposition to THAAD, because THAAD, of course, gives the United States full spectrum vision both into China and Russian military programs. In other words, everyone perceives this as an attempt by the United States to gain military supremacy. Can any power, big or small, allow that to happen under the conditions of Korea, the most heavily militarized part of the planet? I don't think so.
Right, Brian, actually the new Defense Secretary, James Mattis, was in South Korea trying to lock down this deal. And I guess there must be some anxiety here in Washington over whether this is going to go ahead.
Yes, because public opinion in South Korea means something. Back when South Korea was a military dictatorship and the United States occupied it only, and it was really the dominant power, public opinion might not have amounted to much, but it does now. Perhaps as many as 50% of the people in South Korea are saying no to the missile. You know what? South Korean people are proud. It's a big economy. They don't want to be viewed as a pawn on somebody else, this meaning the Pentagon's geostrategic chessboard, because ultimately it doesn't provide security. If there was a clash, a confrontation between the U.S. and China, what would China do? Of course, Soju, where the deployment is taking place, that would be a target for Chinese military. So South Koreans are in fact pawns in somebody else's geostrategic chessboard. They don't want it. They don't want it for a number of reasons. They feel it imposes many burdens on them. This is the 201st day in a row where the people in the area where that's going to be deployed have been protesting. They're older people, they're farmers, they don't want it.
That's where the land has been acquired for this deployment, right?
Yeah, it was a golf course.
Yeah.
There was a land swap with the Lotte Corporation. I mean, that's kind of weird as well. But these are farmers. They grow melons. They're afraid of the energy, the electromagnetic energy pulsation from the THAAD. They were worried about what it's going to mean for their melons. They're also worried about what people perceive about agricultural products. So they're up in arms about it for a number of reasons.
So if we see giant melons coming out of South Korea, we should be worried.
They're going to say melons, not missile defense shields.
Nathan, as we just heard from the spokesman there, the Chinese spokesman, China is opposed to the deployment of THAAD, but how is China making its views known to South Korea?
Anyone who's been on the Chinese internet or Weibo or WeChat in the last few days have heard that, there's a lot of anger. There's even talk of stemming the number of South Korean soap operas, which are really popular, as everyone knows here in South Korea, and K-pop, South Korean K-pop. It hasn't quite got to that yet, but you could, just by reading all this, you can judge just how severe the feeling is in the country. Even if you could argue about whether the deployment is strategically very destabilizing or just a little bit, but it looks like the Chinese government are taking a stand here and saying, look, we really are worried that this is going to destabilize the region, increase. It really reminds me of when the Americans were trying to deploy ballistic missile defense in Eastern Europe. And time and time again, they turned around to the Russians, they said, no, this is not about you, it's about Iran. But it could be used for anything. And it was in the places exactly which were inherently destabilizing for Russia.
There was a similar debate back in the 80s, I think, when Reagan...
And we see what happened, right? We saw the trust that built up at the end of the Cold War between Moscow and Washington sort of dissipate over that, and of course NATO expansion as well.
Okay, Tong Zhua, soap operas notwithstanding, as well as some goods that are being stopped from getting into China, what kind of leverage does China really have to dissuade the United States and South Korea from deploying this system?
Firstly, at the military level, China is making it very clear that if South Korea and the U.S. Insist on the deployment of THAAD, China has a wide range of military measures that it can take to counter the impact of THAAD, including using radio interference to undermine the efficacy of the X-band radar of THAAD, and might even including options that launching offensive missiles to preemptively take out THAAD battery in case there was this necessity. And also with the deployment, China really sees South Korea as peaking side between U.S. and China. And this missile defense deployment also further enhances the overall security alliance among the United States, South Korea, and Japan, which China believes is aiming at undermining China's geostrategic interests. Just as our previous speaker mentioned about the situation in Europe, the expansion of NATO would necessarily be seen by Russia as a threat to its national interest. The strengthening of American security alliance network in the Northeast Asian region is also considered a serious threat to China's security interests. So China will take comprehensive countermeasures, including using its economic leverage to send a signal to South Korea that there is still time to reconsider its decision. And also at this time, there is still hope that we can use diplomatic engagement to reduce current tensions over the Korean Peninsula. There is still hope that the Trump administration might be able to engage with North Korea. The North Korean government is apparently very interested in talking directly with the United States. North Korea has refrained from major military provocations. It has refrained from testing ICBM, and its senior officials openly said that they were waiting for the Trump administration to clarify its North Korea policy. And China would be very interested in playing a role to facilitate such diplomatic engagement, especially directly between North Korea and the United States. And China is also taking measures to fully implement the UN resolution, including the most ban on coal importation from North Korea. So with all these efforts, I think South Korea should really reconsider the necessity to deploy THAAD.
Brian, the situation seems to have escalated. It seems like officials here in Washington are taking a very hard line against China. The United States ambassador, the new United States ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, she said that she's calling for accountability. She's talking about the DPRK's nuclear program, calling for accountability, not just with words, she said, but with actions as well. And what seems to be a departure from what previous administrations have been saying. She said a clear message has to be sent to the DPRK and what she referred to as its enablers. Clear reference to China there. Is the United States picking a fight here with China?
It is picking a fight. It's very aggressive. You had Obama's position of strategic patience, which was a failure because strategic patience meant to wait and wait and wait, not engage DPRK, not to try to improve the relationship with the expectation that somehow the DPRK regime would fall apart. It's not falling apart. It's weathered many storms. It's not going through the worst of its worst period that happened in the mid and early 1990s. So now you have the Trump administration coming in, and I think speaking perhaps with more than one voice. You have Nikki Haley saying, okay, we're not only going to attack or hold accountable the DPRK, but its enablers, clearly signaling, I think, more than anyone, Beijing, perhaps Russia. But here at the same time, we had a week ago reports that a high-level back channel, wasn't really that back channel because we knew about it, official grouping from the North Koreans were coming for talks to probe to see whether there could be an improvement in relations, as started to happen at the last year of the Bill Clinton administration. And then at the last moment, and I mean almost literally at the last moment, the White House announced that the visas were canceled. The State Department said where the visas are granted. The White House said so, no. So is there a debate, one of many in the Trump administration? I think there probably is. But what is most important is that China speak clearly, Russia speak clearly, the people in South Korea speak clearly, because the THAAD missile is a reckless adventure. Once it's easy to get on an escalation ladder, it's very hard to get off.
Okay, we are going to take a break right now. Next, we'll discuss the potential backlash for Korean goods and entertainment in China. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.